I'm Shamini Kore, Director of the IMF's Institute for Capacity Development. This week, we mark the fifth anniversary of the Paris Agreement on climate change in the midst of a global pandemic. Policymakers are looking for solutions that not only tackle the current economic crisis, but also set us on a recovery path that addresses the climate crisis and leads to more equitable and sustainable growth. To discuss these issues, the Institute is pleased to host two very special guests. Neither of them needs much introduction, so I'll be brief. First, we are very pleased to be joined by Special Envoy Mark Carney. He has the distinction of having led not one, but two G7 central banks, having been the governor of the Bank of Canada and then the governor of the Bank of England over the last 13 years. Early this year, he sharpened his focus on an issue he has long been passionate about, taking on the roles of UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance and the Finance Advisor to the UK presidency of the COP26 Climate Conference, now less than a year away. He's also moving forward private sector involvement in climate change as Vice Chair of Brookfield Asset Management, member of the Global Advisory Board of BIMCO, and several other private foundations. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Very good. Engaging him in our conversation is the IMF's Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. She came to the fund last year from the World Bank, where she was the first CEO. She began her public service career at the bank as an environmental economist and also served as a vice president and commissioner of the European Commission. Kristalina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Armini. And very warm welcome to Mark Carney. I cannot think of a better guest to discuss how far we have gone since the Paris Agreement came into being and what is the road ahead. So let me just make 2 points from my side before I turn to Mark, and I know everybody in the audience is very eager to hear from him. And my two cents, my contribution, the opening is the following. One, at the IMF, we recognize that the climate actions we would take in our institution and globally are paramount for our future. We have embraced climate in everything we do. How we think about climate policies in our well-known surveillance work, how we integrate climate considerations in policy advice to countries, how we think of climate-related financial risks. In other words, what does it mean for financial stability? And I am proud to say that in this crisis, we have embraced wholeheartedly thinking of the post-COVID world as one that is green and fair. And that takes me to my second point. We look into the future very mindful that 2021 is going to be a transformative year. The question is transforming towards what? Are we going to see more inequality and a world in which we are not embracing our responsibility to the future generations, or we would use this once in a generation chance to push a climate stimulus, a green investment that is going to play a tremendously important role for framing growth that is sustainable. In other words, aligned entirely with the Paris Agreement. So far, what are the facts? In the very first round of stimulus, there has not been that much attention to greening our economy. In fact, our assessment tells us that in the first rounds of stimulus, only 5% was aligned with the objective of the new climate economy, low carbon climate resilient. But this is now changing. And what we want to use this conversation for is to inject more impetus and enthusiasm of steering this change. And thus enters Mark Carney. Mark, you have been an incredible force for good. What you have done as the Governor of Bank of England, as the chair of the FSB, is absolutely remarkable. And I know that this is something incredibly close to your heart. So my first question to you is going to be this. Looking backwards in these 5 years since the Paris Agreement, what do you think have been the most remarkable positive shifts, and what did we miss? And looking forward, what is your ambition for the for COP26, for this transformative, potentially very important year 2021?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me, Kristalina. It's hard not to be enthusiastic and energetic with you and the fund. And I want to compliment really the transformation, as you've said. You've taken this to an absolutely different level, and you've brought climate into all aspects. And that's really what's required in order to address the issue. And not just to manage a risk, but really to realize these opportunities and realize the benefits of jobs and a just transition. So, and I'm sure we'll come to that in more detail. But you asked a great question, which is, so let's think about over the last 5 years. And I think part of what was positive was the shortfall of Paris. And let me explain that. Because what I liked about Paris was, at first, obviously, it was an innovative approach to have nationally determined contributions and then add them up, but have an honest appraisal of that add up and to say, even though the objective was less than 2 degrees with the stretch of 1.5 degrees, when you put all the country programs together, it was 2.8 if they were implemented. And of course, one of the things, as you know, that was missed is they weren't all implemented. So that is why we moved to a trajectory above 3 degrees very recently. But the honesty of that and the accounting of that and the clarity of the objective has catalyzed change, including in the financial sector, which is accelerating, and we'll come to that, but also in the corporate sector and broader stakeholders. So the discipline of having the objective and the clarity and the honesty. And again, when you look at, and I'll give another example of this, which you just gave, when you did the IMF's analysis of the initial stimulus, the emergency stimulus that was put out, okay, but let's be honest about what proportion of that was moving us in the direction to the economy of the future as opposed to the economy of the past. And so I think that we have to retain that clarity of purpose and that transparency and that objectivity in terms of our efforts. Now, let's think about where we are going, where we're going forward. And I'll just say a couple of words, if I may, about the financial sector where I'm focused, because that clarity has brought in to the mindsets of companies and increasingly banks and asset owners and asset managers, investors, that they need to be thinking about the transition to net zero, managing the risks associated with it, but actually seizing the opportunities, because I think we all recognize that if you're a company, you have a technology, or you're making investments shifting from coal towards renewables or what have you, that's part of the solution. If you're providing part of the solution to the world's most seemingly intractable problem, you are creating a tremendous amount of value. And you're creating first and foremost a social value for your employees, for your communities, reducing pollution today. You're creating social value across generations because of addressing climate change, but you're also creating financial value. And so the upside there. Now, and we'll get to this, of course, government policies can enhance that financial value, can add to those incentives. And last point, to bring together the objective, net zero, the transparency and the objectivity of what policies are bringing them together. If you become, those are the building blocks of credibility. And one thing the IMF knows is the importance of credibility, the importance of credibility of financial actors, of central banks, of fiscal authorities. If you have credibility, you catalyze action well beyond the actions you take as a public authority. So
this is really great, and it actually takes me straight to my next question. You led the task force on financial disclosure, climate-related financial disclosure, and it has made progress. What is yet to be done? If you were to look at this, what next, and how the fund can help to create the right incentives exactly for what you're talking about, embracing climate action, not only because it is morally right, and it is, but also because it is financially attractive.
Yeah. So I think there's two building blocks here, and they done properly, they're mutually reinforcing and catalytic, and they amplify each other. And so, starting with the financial disclosure, it's come a long way. It's only been 5 years since that task force was even struck. It was struck at Paris, led by Mike Bloomberg, and remembering that this was predominantly the private sector answering the question of what disclosure do private financial institutions need to address or to manage climate risks, and coming up with that answer. Now what's happened is it's being applied, and it's being applied quite widely, but not in its entirety, in terms of coverage or in terms of the core recommendations. And it really has reached a point where we now have, and it's a phenomenal number even for the IMF, $170 trillion of financial assets, institutions controlling financial assets worth $170 trillion, who want this disclosure from companies. So we're reaching the point where it needs to become mandatory, and we need the authorities to do so. We see Europe leading with the Non-Financial Disclosure Directive, which is broader than climate, but has TCFD at its base. We see the UK, the Chancellor last month announced that the UK will have mandatory TCFD disclosure, and the steps towards that point. We see a number of other countries having comply or explain type disclosures with it. But we want by Glasgow to have pathways to mandatory for all major economies to TCFD disclosure. And that will have huge amplification benefits globally. We also want the standard setters, and in this case, the most important is the IFRS, which is consulting on sustainability disclosure standards, to have TCFD at its base and its first. So the IMF pushing for that. That's the first point. The second, on the financial side, is I think we all know that we've learned a lot about climate-related risks in managing in the last 5 years, but we need to learn a lot more. And that's the public authorities, if I include myself in that, but it's our private financial institutions. So supervision of these climate risks, stress testing of climate-related risks, and the IMF building that expertise and encouraging these activities is important. Then the other point, so that's one whole building block. Can I just make the other building block, which is on policy, and the credibility of climate policy. And that includes regulatory policy, it's credible price paths for carbon, it's also smart fiscal expenditure, and the combination of those two bring forward the adjustment. Much in the, well, you know this, again, I say the IMF knows all about credible policy, but in order to reinforce this point, Janet Yellen and I wrote a paper for the G30, which showed how the interaction between proper financial disclosure and risk management and credible policy pull forward adjustment. And I think making that point, and I'll make this last point if I may, is the IMF, with its expertise, credibility, reach, trusted advisor, making that point to policymakers around the world that the more credible you are, the more the market will do the work for you, pull forward adjustments. So at the point where the carbon price is higher or regulation is tighter, the economy will have adjusted into it already.
And this is the moment to say that we have taken a decision at the IMF that in our financial sector assessments, we are going to integrate these risks and make sure that countries can quantify the risks and then send the right signals to financial institutions and to the real economy investors for which these signals are so critical. You now have set up together with the chief executive of Standard Chartered, with Bill Winters, a new task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. And I want to use our precious time to talk about your vision, where we are going to go, and what the fund can do. But before that, just a small anecdote. I was director for environment at the World Bank when we dreamt of trading carbon, and we created the prototype carbon fund. It has gone its own way, and there are all kinds of successes and failures around the carbon market. How are you going to deal with the problems we had in the past, especially the worries about greenwashing and projects promising, not delivering? Where would Mark Carney take the carbon market of the future?
Yeah, well, so let's start with the good news. The good news is that there have been different efforts around these carbon markets, and there are learnings to take from those efforts, including the World Bank's efforts and the private carbon market that developed and died just after the financial crisis. The second bit of good news is that the shift towards net zero is creating huge demand from companies because as they transition, they need these offsets as part of their transition. I want to underscore this, you know this, but for those who don't follow us closely, this is about a transition. This is not an end state. This is a market for a transition that preserves that precious carbon budget for progress. Now, what we have done is, with Bill Winters, as you say, Annette Nazareth, who you know, with former SEC commissioner, co-leading with Bill, and then we have 50 institutions, including a number of non-governmental institutions, but many from the private sector, all the way from verification, certification, verification of projects, clearing and settlement, exchange-traded, a core exchange-traded contract that, in spot and future markets that would be created with then an OTC market around that. So the whole architecture, including all of the plumbing being put in place, learning from previous challenges. That blueprint, there's a consultation out now. There is a blueprint for the market coming out in the first quarter. We want the IMF's expertise, and there's a sort of public way of engaging, but also directly engaging, and we'll directly engage with the fund on the development of this market, which, after all, is being built for private companies in order to achieve their objectives. But will, if we do this right, and you know this, but I think it bears repeating, if we do this right, these will mean flows of up to 50 to 100 billion per year to these projects. 3/4, 80% of those will go into developing and emerging economies. And this is entirely separate from the famous 100 billion discussion that imperative, I should say, that as part of Paris and other accords. But it's real private sector flows that would develop. So it's a crucial market to get right. I think we can do it, but we need all expertise being engaged. And actually, I'll finish on this. We have over 130 institutions now engaged in the development of this market through the consultation and the core working group.
What role for carbon price in making this market work?
Well, I think,
and if I can ask one follow-up question, because we are going to run out of time, and I do want to get from you all the wisdom we can extract for our audience. How to manage the political economy of carbon price in terms of people that are vulnerable, affected, disfranchised, and protesting, making carbon price stick. So one, what role for carbon price? Two, how to make it a just transition.
Okay, so in terms of this carbon market, to be clear, the market is a market in offsets, nature-based solutions, and which will establish a price for those instruments, those fungible instruments. the carbon price, the national carbon prices that are put in place will, of course, catalyze emissions reductions and activities, but we're not making those markets fundable. We're not making this fungible with the ETS market, say in Europe or other markets like that. So carbon price is catalyzing action, and credibility on that carbon price path, incredibly important. Now, on just transition, and this is a point I know you've made a number of times and the fund's done the analysis on. I think we've learned, and it's incredibly important to underscore, the importance of recycling a substantial proportion, if not all, of the carbon price, certainly to the most disadvantaged in our economies, but which in many cases, and I know the US studies have suggested up to 40% of the population would receive rebates from the carbon price that made them whole, and all they saw was a change in the relative price of carbon and carbon-intensive goods, which of course shifts demands. Of course, Canada recycles virtually 100% of the resources, and so that's important. But as you well know, the other big element of just transition is actually the structural transition and the jobs that will to be created for the future, and that's where bringing together the other elements of the stimulus packages, these medium-term stimulus packages are incredibly important, including some of the sustainable stimulus that will, and this IMF own analysis is in many cases more job-heavy, has bigger economic multipliers than conventional shovel-ready, so-called shovel-ready stimulus.
And to finish on that note, what we have projected is that a green investment push next year, the year after, when there is ample capacity, very low interest rates, can help us with the exit from the COVID-induced crisis and put us on a structurally different path, on a green path. And not only that, but we concluded that if countries work together, in other words, if it is a coordinated push, it would be more effective. With the same money, countries would achieve 2/3 bigger boost of GDP.
Wow.
So are you optimistic that in 2021 we would see more global cooperation and possibly a coordinated action on green?
Well, I'm going to make a bold prediction that there's room to see more global cooperation than we've seen in the last few years. First point. Second point, I'm optimistic we will see it. I think that the fund's work is incredibly important in all respects, but also around these issues, because you're making tangible points that a number of policymakers feel intuitively, but the substance is there. And I think the early returns in the European Recovery Fund, the French, the German budgets, the UK 10-point plan, I know the Canadian fall update, so there's a series of measures that have come into place that are putting substance behind these types of policies. And I think also, so I am optimistic in that regard, but I think if we've learned anything about climate is we shouldn't bank optimism. We have to be realistic. We have to have action and push. And we still know, and everyone, the reason why people want to have this conversation and work on these issues is we're late. We're late to this issue, and we have to catch up.
Yes, and that is what we all have to commit to. We commit to that at the IMF. We recognize time is not our friend, but we also see this opportunity to shape up the economy of tomorrow. And we are very optimistic knowing that Mark Carney is there working for it. Thank you very much, Mark. As always, incredibly exciting to talk to you. Very best of luck with the 100 billion in offsets.
Yes.
In your incredibly important function as a special envoy to the Secretary General on climate, and of course advising Prime Minister Boris Johnson on COP26. If we were in the physical meeting space, that would have been the time that there would be a round of applause. So you would only get it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well,
Thank you, Mark.
I look forward to being there at some point soon. Yeah.
Thank you. Back to Sharmini.
Mark, Kristalina, thank you so much